Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Festival of Politics 2025. It's great to see so many people here. Looking forward to this afternoon session where we'll be looking at fact-free information, and we'll be doing that in partnership with the Scottish Youth Film Foundation. So later on, I'll be asking you all to get involved and to ask our panel questions. I'm looking forward to your contributions. It's important that everybody that wants to contribute can do so, and I would just ask you to make sure that we all remain respectful even when we hear something that we fundamentally disagree with. So we will be filming this live, but it won't be going out live. But just so you're all aware, it will be on the Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel in around a couple of weeks' time. If you can't wait that long and you want to get involved, if you want to comment live, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You're welcome to use the @VisitScottParrell handle on X or on Instagram @ScottParrell. So, without any further ado, to today's events. So I'm very, very pleased to be joined here by Rachel Amery, Faith Bateman, Mark Franco and Scott Mackay. Rachel is the Scotsman's political correspondent, and she's based here in the Scottish Parliament. She's a multimedia journalist covering Scottish politics. She's the author of the Steamy Morning Politics newsletter, as well as contributing to the Scotsman's The Steamy Political podcast. She also freelances as a political commentator for the BBC and STV. Faith Bateman has over 17 years' experience as a social subjects teacher, including 8 as subject leader for modern studies and politics. She's now the education lead at the West of Scotland Development Education Centre. She supports educators across Scotland to embed global citizenship into their practice. Mark Franco works as Head of Public Affairs for the Full Fact organisation, which is the UK's leading independent fact-checking organisation, I'm told. In this role, he oversees the charity's advocacy, policy and communications work. And prior to joining Full Fact, Mark worked for over 25 years as a journalist, a media trainer and a lecturer. And finally, we have Scott Mackay, who is the co-founder of the Scottish Youth Film Foundation, which was founded 11 years ago in West Lothian. What started as a single local project has now become a national charity, and the Scottish Youth Film Foundation is currently developing several private projects in film, education and AI. So a warm welcome to all of our panellists. So as I've said, there's going to be lots of opportunity for you to question our panellists. I'm going to start off by warming them up for you. So while I'm doing that, I hope you're all thinking of really challenging, tricky questions that you can put to them. So I think we should probably start off with why we're all here, first of all. And I would like to ask the panel how it would define misinformation and how that concept of misinformation has made its way into our political, education and media worlds in the last 5 years. And I'll maybe start at the far end with you, Scott.
Okay, thanks very much for the question. Thanks for inviting me along. Misinformation, there are many definitions, and just looking up in preparation for this panel, there is a difference between misinformation and disinformation. I think it is very much a spectrum. There can be misinformation that is just wrong. You know, it could be anything from a conspiracy story to just a factual inaccuracy. And then whatever way around you look at it, you can go to disinformation, which, you know, that's a deliberate attempt to misinform almost. So that's just information that is wrong, but with a motive behind it. And the motive behind it is for me, very, very key to the questions. But it can take it, the important thing is it can take any form. It can be a text, it can be a WhatsApp message, it can be a TikTok, a reel, it can be a news story, a piece in the, it can be anything. And it's just that it's not the truth. And how do we define the truth? And the difficulty obviously we're seeing is that there, you never thought defining the truth was that big of a problem, but now it is.
Mark?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Good to see you all. Yeah, I think just to build on what Scott was saying, the key thing here is the question of intent. So at Full Fact and in the work that we do, it's important to distinguish between things that are done accidentally and things that are done deliberately. So there are a lot of us who are online from time to time and will see something. We may be interested in it, we may share it. We may share it without thinking. We may then discover that what we've shared is inaccurate. That is leading to misinformation. But if I deliberately go out to seek something that I know to be false and share it, I've involved myself in an act of subterfuge, and I am deliberately deceiving you, and that is disinformation. So we see both forms of mis and disinformation in our political system, in our world around us every day. But we see much more of the misinformation than the disinformation. I think we should be honest about that. I think a lot of politicians, and we'll talk about this hopefully in the course of our discussion this afternoon, will inadvertently misinform us about things from time to time. This might be because of a lack of context, a lack of statistical accuracy, but it's not always, despite what the media might claim from time to time and what we might perceive, it's not always because they're trying deliberately to mislead. There is instances of this. There are foreign actors involved in our systems from time to time. There are bots that will organise online and will direct us to information deliberately to misinform us. But the vast majority of what we see and we come into contact on a daily basis is misinformation.
Thanks, Mark. Faith?
Yeah, so I think both of you have given really broad and vast definitions of mis and disinformation, and I'm just thinking about the perspective that I come at this from, and it's obviously from the classroom, and thinking about young people and the kinds of information and the sheer amount of information that they have at their fingertips every single day. And it's, you know, from when I started teaching 17 or so years ago to now, the amount of information young people have is incredible. And when you're in a classroom and you're teaching about various different topics, young people know about it and they're getting their information from lots of different information sources. So as a teacher and as an educator, you have to be ahead of the game. You have to understand the difference between mis and disinformation and be able to help young people understand in the world in which they live, to help them decipher all the information that's available to them.
The other panel members have obviously covered quite a wide range there. Rachel, what's left from your point of view?
Yes, don't want to go over what was already been said very well there by my other panellists. I'm obviously looking at it as a journalist in the media perspective. I think there's sort of two main issues there. I think one is when we're trying to write our stories and do our research is trying to differentiate what is real and what is not real, for example, and trying to make sure we are following what is the truth. And I think the other aspect of it is trying to sort of build trust between the media and the public. I think for a long time now that's been eroding, and I think now when we're seeing sort of this rise of fake news and misinformation, disinformation, trying to sort of prove that newspapers and media outlets are the trusted source can sometimes be difficult as well. And when there's so much misinformation, disinformation around, it can be a challenge because there's so many different competing voices. It depends on who the public want to listen to at each time.
We hear a lot about the responsibility of social media companies and whether they can and should be doing more to counteract the volume of fake information, AI-generated content, things like that. So what does the panel feel can be placed at the door of the social media companies? And I'll maybe come to you first of all on that one, Mark.
Well, it's a really important question, and I think if you think about the volume, the scale of misinformation that we confront on a daily basis, much of it is at the doorsteps of the social media companies because they are the gatekeepers. They are the ones that are, despite what many of them will claim, they're not editors, they're not publishers, they are generating it, and algorithmically they're pushing it to us in ways that we can't avoid. So we believe at Full Fact that the social media companies should have a statutory obligation to involve themselves in media literacy work. In other words, that they should actually step up to the plate and take responsibility for the misinformation that is circulating on their platforms. And whilst they will say from time to time that they can't do anything about the volume of things that people are talking about, they could very easily do a lot more to both downrank some of what is circulating at scale, and equally they could do a lot more to educate and inform people about how to spot that misinformation, spot the manipulation, the AI fakery, the things that are circulating online on their platforms on a daily basis. And I think that they should do a lot more of that.
Faith, from your perspective, we're all very well aware of the addiction that young people in particular, we're all addicted to devices, but particularly young people. So how big a concern is this for you?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that it's important what you said there, that we're all addicted, so I think it's showing young people that, yeah, this is happening to everybody, and I think it is concerning, but I think when something's happening, I think that's when we need to do something about it, and I think there's a huge learning that can be done in schools, talking about, just kind of phone hygiene and thinking about what that might look like for a young person, and we know in the news now there's lots of schools that have policies about no phone zones, phones going away. But phones, I suppose, in a way can be helpful as well for learning if they're used properly. But, I suppose you bring in parents and carers into that as well and saying, if you have your phone at home, where are you using it? Are we using it in a space that everybody can see? We're not doing it on your own in your bedroom, for example. So there's work there that can be done as well, I think, to kind of tackle that constant go-to phone when you're looking at your social media and all the news and things.
And Rachel, how much responsibility do you think lies at the door of the social media companies?
This is a discussion that we're having a lot amongst all the other journalists and things like that, because I think so often certain stories that perhaps are not completely true, they do run away from you so fast on social media, and it can be really hard as a journalist to sort of try and keep up with it, for example. So I think just one example I'm thinking of recently, so I live in Perth, and about a fortnight ago there was protest and a counter-protest around the hotels housing asylum seekers, for example, and it was based on something that had been said on social media, had then spread very, very quickly on social media, and the council, for example, some of the councillors, I think some of the MSPs as well representing that area, were reacting to it and saying, look, this is not true, see the statement from the council have said this is not true, but it was so reactionary. The story had kind of got away on social media so much. I think that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment that we're sort of facing, is how quickly it can spread on social media there. And so I think that's where it maybe comes into play. There are some things that social media companies are doing. So for example, there are times where I share a story that I'm on X, and I haven't read it, because I've written the story, so that's okay. And I click on it and say share, and it says, no, are you sure you want to share it because you haven't opened it and read it? That's good, but you can easily just say, yes, I have read it, it's fine, and you share it, and so that's where it comes a problem. And I think another problem there is, I suppose, headlines. We are trying so hard at newspapers to write headlines that people want to click on, and write headlines that grab people's attention, grab people in, and make people want to click on it. I think the sort of the saying, I hate the saying, but the saying that we're going at the moment is a reason to care, reason to click. I mean, I hate the saying, but that's kind of what we're trying to do at the moment. And unfortunately, it then does mean condensing a lot of information into a tiny little headline. And it does mean that people only see the headline, and then it can get all arms and legs out of the back of that there. So that's a bit of an issue, as well as the fact that the shop window, if you want to think about it that way, you're only seeing the headline of the story on social media.
Yeah, Scott, you must see a lot of this in your work with young people. So would you like to see greater regulation in place here?
I think it's just where you're getting your information from is actually a factor, as Mark's saying, and it's all about intent. So what you're looking at is that the social media platform is that buffer zone where disinformation, so if somebody, and it can be any kind of social media, it can be WhatsApp, it can be just that kind of a service, not saying it is WhatsApp before they jump on me, but that social media platform becomes the transition stage where disinformation, which could well be deliberate and intended to deceive and produce a very certain effect, becomes misinformation, because the intent of the people sharing it is not the same as the intent of the person or the organisation that started it. So therefore, your Facebook, your whatever social media, that's where that changes. And what was disinformation might be a bot, might be a group who aren't fond of immigrants, could be a political group. They put disinformation out and bank on it becoming misinformation, which is more widely shared. And it's done, well, I'll maybe talk more about it later, one of the very first things that we try and teach young people is that attention is the new currency. And, you know, care to click, you know, it's the new currency. Chris Hayes of MSNBC has just written a book about it. So obviously that's what everybody's trying to grab. And attention works on emotion. And so when I'm teaching young people about film, basically what I start with is, what is a film for? And every film's the same in that it's there to change how you think and feel. And that's a Hollywood blockbuster, it's a frame of a film, it's a TV story, it's a text. It's got the same motivation behind it, and you have to be aware of that, even just when you read anything. And the difficulty is, we're all knackered. We're just tired. It's really, really hard to go, whoa, hold on, I check my emotions. I'm doom scrolling, it's late at night, I want to go, you know what I mean? I should have been asleep an hour ago, and I'm too tired. So, yeah, there's a big problem there, but to me, to answer your question, that social media thing has a responsibility because it's that phase, it's the stage where disinformation becomes misinformation.
So we're meeting here just now less than 9 months from the next Scottish parliamentary election, the biggest event in our democracy in Scotland. So can I ask you each to think about your concerns about that democratic process and how vulnerable it is to being skewed by mis and disinformation, and what, if anything, we can do to circumvent that? Rachel, you report on politics from this place, so I'll maybe start with you.
Yeah, I think there is concerns sort of out there. I think even if we just take a recent example, so back in June we had the Hamilton Lark Hall and Stonehouse by-election, which was won by Scottish Labour. There was an issue there with some political advertising by Reform UK. Now, Reform did very well in that by-election, but one of the campaign messages that they had was deliberately sort of attacking the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, for example, and putting out messaging that he would, that if Scottish Labour were in charge, that he would prioritise Pakistani communities in Scotland. Now, he hasn't said that. And the Scottish journalists themselves tried to ask Nigel Farage that you're not going to apologise for this, you're going to retract this statement, it's not true. And he basically said, no, I'm standing by this. And it works for his party. His party did very, very well in that by-election. And so that's kind of an example, it's very recent, where we are seeing misinformation by very high-profile politicians who traditionally you'd want to trust, because you're supposed to trust politicians. And that's where it's sort of now breaking down, because you're seeing examples like that, for example, happening. And so if we're seeing that happening again in the next Scottish Parliament election, then that could be problematic, because voters are then thinking, well, what do I trust, what do I not trust? Does this confirm my beliefs? Does it go against my beliefs? There's a whole lot of things we need to think about there.
Faith, from your point of view, dangers to the election process?
Yeah, I think just kind of like what Scott was saying there, it's thinking about where people are getting information, and you mentioned like attention, you mentioned emotions, and I think, you know, votes for 16-year-olds, you know, you've got young people for the first time coming to the election, and you've got to think about where are they getting their news and where are they getting their information. And I think there's probably quite a lot of work to be done around that. And, you know, if you're seeing a meme or you're seeing whatever's out there, it's like thinking about, if it's short, you mentioned that, reading behind that, what's actually going on, and having the skills, which I know we'll talk about later, but having the skills to dig deeper and come up with your own perspective and your own stance. So, yeah, I think for young people it's going to be particularly hard to navigate.
Is that something you would agree with from your perspective, Scott?
Absolutely. Like we get down to the micro, and we teach people, you know, the camera's here for a reason, and we go into all that and teach them those skills. but I absolutely agree with Faith. I mean, you've got to think, just as we're saying, if you compare the social media actor as being the stage where it goes from disinformation to misinformation, if you compare it to, like, would Faith get away with that in a school? Like, your teachers are absolutely scrutinised, and my wife's a teacher, I can absolutely say this. They're scrutinised about what they do with every minute of their day, and they're there trying to give the very best information. And of course, they're up against absolutely a world inside a phone, and so you need to be able to have the tools, like, what's wrong about that? But the language tools, the very critical thinking analytical tools that Faith's talking about, they're not that common in the population at large. You know, let's not just talk about young people, but also I would say it's much broader brush now. I don't know if Rachel would agree with me. It's not misinformation or disinformation about particular policy. Sometimes it is, but a lot of it has become just culture wars. So it's not even about a particular fact. It's about a way of looking at the world and so on. And you have to be able to recognise that language and the visual sleight of hand that is being undertaken to get that message across, to take you down that rabbit hole. Yeah, we see it a lot, and some of the things that we teach young people, they're like, oh well, never thought about that. But I could teach that to adults as well and get the same response.
Mark, this is kind of day job territory for you. So how vulnerable do you see our democracy being from fake news, misinformation, disinformation?
I think it's no exaggeration to say that this is probably the biggest, the most critical time that we're living in from a democratic point of view. I mean, I think all the polling points to a huge trust deficit. There's numbers of surveys that have been conducted in the last couple of years that have shown that the public no longer trusts politicians, their political system, their trust in institutions is at an all-time low. And what this means is that they are naturally looking at an electoral system and an election in very sceptical terms, in very cynical terms, which means that, to pick up on what Rachel was saying in a way, that it becomes almost that journalists are looking at an election cycle in terms of how to make it entertaining, as opposed to how to make it informative. I'm not saying all journalists are doing this, but there is a tendency to try and to build on the attention economy, to try and to create a system or create a process that people will naturally want to engage in, despite their cynicism, despite that sense of disengagement. And what this means is that there's a greater propensity for things to be misinformed, for things to be misjudged, for people to look for what is titillating, entertaining, the kind of things that would draw them into something without necessarily telling them anything particularly vital. So what happens as a consequence of that is that AI fakery starts to rise up algorithmically on social media platforms and in the information space. People start to see things that they are drawn towards because other people are sharing it, and they start to share it because they lack the literacy skills that we've just been talking about, and they don't have the ability to be able to think critically or sufficiently critically to step back or step to the side and say, what is this actually asking me to do, or what is this really all about? And things that are sent in parody are then shared with seriousness. And that's what really worries me about forthcoming elections in Scotland and in Wales next year. And then as we lead up to the next general election scheduled for 2029, is that our system is not sufficiently robust. We don't have the legislative protections in place to protect the electorate, to protect all of us against these things becoming ever more disruptive. Politicians are drawn to manipulate content because it's free for them to do so, and because they are likely to get more bang for their buck for doing so. And that's not to say that they're looking to deliberately deceive, but we've seen instances at full fact of politicians using memes, of changing the colours on their political party in order to appeal to politicians, to the public who might be more persuaded to vote one way or another way, to take something that was meant in jest and re-edit it and then recirculate it. To pick up on the by-election that Rachel was talking about at Hamilton last year, it wasn't just that he never said it, it was that the speech was edited so that it sounded like he did say it. And these things were then recirculated. So all of this, you know, we're in a world now where these things are too easy and the legislative protections are just not there to support us.
If I could maybe stay with you for a minute, Mark. I mean, obviously your organisation does a huge amount of fact-checking. How would you respond to the challenge that fact-checking itself can be biased, given that politicians and others interpret facts differently?
Yeah, it's a charge that we've seen a few times, and our response to it is to say we are rigorously impartial about how we fact check, about how we choose what we fact check, and we're very transparent about what we do and how we do it on our website. Anybody can head there to look for themselves, fullfact.org online. But one thing we're never impartial about are facts. The one thing in the world that we will never be impartial about is that facts matter, and that we are driven by evidence and we're driven by what is factually evident. So if somebody or an organisation, a public figure, be that a politician, a business leader, a public organisation, put something out into the public domain for us all to look at, to read, to digest, to act upon that is factually inaccurate, we're not concerned what persuasion they're coming from, what angle they're coming from. What drives us is the evidence.
We've probably seen that in, for example, BBC Verify, which seems to have evolved slightly from being just an analysis of what has been said, whether it's factually correct or not, into what our fact-checking team is doing today and how they're going about assessing the information. So it's about that process.
It's the process,
yeah.
Being transparent about the process. Yeah.
Faith, can I ask you, from your experience of working in education, what's your sense of how well enabled young people are to critically think from an early age? And do you think there needs to be something about that critical thinking capacity being a mandatory part of the curriculum?
Yeah, in short, yeah, I think it definitely does. I think I'm just going to speak from my experience because things are changing, things are evolving, and when I was in the classroom, you know, social media has taken it's changed, it's evolved. So I think when I was teaching, you know, young people maybe didn't need a little bit of help with that. But I think now young people are so aware, they are so engaged, and quite often around certain issues, they're ahead of the game. But I do really think that there needs to be something, you know, something maybe with a space within the curriculum where we look at digital literacy skills. And my work, I do a lot of work around global citizenship, and one of the key things around global citizenship is skill building. And part of that is, you know, we've mentioned it already, it's critical thinking, it's problem solving. So young people are really, really good at that around certain issues if you've got some amazing teachers who are bringing those skills out. But I think you probably need to do a little bit more work around through the lens of digital literacy and providing space and opportunity for young people to talk about that in the classroom. And there are certain subjects that that lends itself to already. You know, I'm a social subjects teacher, so within that we do look at bias, we do look at exaggeration, and that happens in the English classroom, etc. But I think there probably needs to be something a little bit further when, you know, you're talking about social media. So things like, you know, you're seeing a post. How do you know what you're seeing is true? And then perhaps signposting young people to organisations like Mark, that could be a go-to for them. Yeah, have a look at a fact, like something like Full Fact to check, and giving them the specific tools to really be critical. Take the emotion out of it, because a lot of, you know, we're not just talking about politics here, we're talking about, you know, I think for a young person today, for anybody, like, social media is so exhausting in a lot of ways. You're told, you know, what to wear, what to think. You know, I'm a parent, so I'm in an algorithm about how to parent properly, and it can be just really exhausting. So it's about taking that step back and thinking, right, where are my critical faculties here? What am I is this true? So yeah, I think there is space in the curriculum, and there should be, to tackle that around critical media literacy. And it probably should be done from a very, very young age, and all the way through school. And it's something that I think, you know, maybe a strategic approach where all teachers, it maybe even goes into, you know, in initial teacher training, that everybody's getting that, because the narrative's certainly changing around that when we're talking about global citizenship and that type of education. It does start from when you become a teacher, and it's weaved all the way through.
Thank you. Time to hear from you now. So questions, comments for the panel members. I think we've got one over here immediately. If you could keep your hand raised until the microphone reaches you, and I'll come to other people in turn. Thank you.
Thank you. Could government do better? I take as my example the use of slogans, and that particular one, follow the science, during COVID. The nature of science is controversy, and many people did not believe there was a science to be followed. I think even the scientific commentators found it quite difficult to calm a public and inform a public. So choice of words and slogans, how important or otherwise are they?
Scott, I think I'll invite you to respond first.
Okay, well, I'm not quite sure I heard correctly, but just how important am I getting it right, how important are slogans, and should the government be doing something more about science reporting? Is that what your question was? I'm sorry if I've not got it right.
It wasn't specifically, but I think we should.
I mean, just on the governmental thing, and to go with what the panel have been saying, and it's particularly Faith about that whole education, my experience is that science is about trying to remove controversy. All the scientists I've ever met or read or followed, they're all about the uncertainty. They seek uncertainty, and they go, do I know that for a fact? The scientific approach is actually possibly one we could all be. Is that right? Is that right? I better check that. That's a very scientific method approach. But to go with what Faith was saying, I think the government and education can certainly do more. But it's not much more. This is a cultural thing. We're all talking about young people and whatnot, and I deal with young people. But to me, what we need to do with the coming explosion in AI and the ability for anyone to make a meme that's absolutely realistic. My daughters are 17 and 15. They spot AI faster than I do, but it's getting harder all the time. I think that what we need to do is culturally come to a position where the first question is not, how can that be? But the first question is it? Is that right? And that should be culturally, not just young people. It's not just a governmental thing. It's not just Mark's doing all this brilliant work. The first question anybody should be asking when they read something, particularly if they like it or don't like it, should be, is it? And go straight to Mark's, go to Mark's website. And so, I teach at SIF, we teach young people how emotions are manipulated and how feelings and thoughts are manipulated through film. And I can teach them that. But I think the very, very first thing that we should all be taught is doubt. Like, let me check that, because the government can't give you a desire for veracity. They can't give you a curiosity for truth and accuracy. You have to bring that yourself. And I think I'm not going back to school to learn that, and I don't think many of us in here are, though some might. But it's that thing, I think, that above all, because to go back, if Rachel was just writing nonsense in the paper the whole time and not fact-checking anything, she'd soon be out of a job. So there are professional people out there doing it, but I think it's a cultural thing. We need to go, right, what professionals can I go to and find that information and actually check something? I don't know if that answers your question.
Rachel, you'll have covered so many government announcements over the years, so what's your response to this responsibility the government has to get its messaging right?
I think you were referring to the COVID pandemic there, and I think there was a lot of mistrust. And I think because the information was coming from primarily politicians and journalists, and over the past few years, not even just the recent years, but going back a long time, like back to the Leveson inquiry and things like that, trust has been eroded, I think, between both those groups of people and the rest of the public, unfortunately. So that's something that maybe we sort of work on a bit more, is trying to build back that level of trust. And as you were saying there, like, as journalists, before things go to print, even if it is going online, for example, there's a lot of steps to go through, there's a lot of hoops to jump through. Sometimes it has to go past a lawyer, it always has to go past an editor. There's so many people have to have their eyes on it before it gets even put on the website. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten about. I think some people think it's like, oh, just type it out and out it goes, and that doesn't actually happen in real life. But if you're not a journalist behind a sort of an official media brand like the Scotsman, for example, then you can just click, off it goes, and it just sort of goes off into the ether and can grow arms and legs. So I think, again, trying to differentiate what are people doing behind the screen to get that information out onto the screen first. Is it a case of just someone writing and off it goes, or is it a journalist having to do research, having to go through all these different steps, having to get it checked over by so many different people? I think better understanding of that would go a long way, and I think maybe more transparency as to what it is we're doing would help there too.
Mark, Rachel's just talked there about the need to build back trust. How on earth can we do that given the scale of what we're talking about here?
It's very challenging, but I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about are the starting points for that journey. I think what Faith was talking about in terms of literacy is a really big part of it, that we have to start, and your Faith was saying we need to start earlier. I would start in primary school, and I think that the curriculum reviews that are happening both here in Scotland and in England are absolutely central to that, because it's no longer enough to say to people, this is a niche subject, this is something that you can do in your spare time, this is something that if you happen to be interested in the world, in the internet, go off and think about it. This needs to be across every single subject, be it science, be it literature, be it history, be it economics. This is not a citizenship education topic. This is the world as we see it today. We live in a digital age. All of us live for our phones. I mean, if you think about how much time you spend every day on one of these, as opposed to just having a conversation with somebody, and how much of the content that you are coming into contact with on one of these every single day is manipulated, it's no longer enough to say, well, there's just a training course that I can do for 1 hour a day, or 1 hour, every 6 months, and that will cover me. It has to be much more, embedded in the curriculum. So that's the first thing. And I think beyond that, politicians need to actually put their money where their mouth is, frankly, about this. We've heard for too long, and Keir Starmer, when he was on his first day in office, stood at the steps of Downing Street and said, I want to restore trust. I realise there is a problem with trust. I realise that for too long, people have been let down, and my administration will put this right. What have we seen? We have not seen any legislation being brought forward by the government that will do anything really fundamentally to deal with what we've been talking about today. The Online Safety Act, which is now in law, deals with particular illegal harms, but doesn't deal with a whole plethora of legal harms. So in other words, it deals with things like violent pornography and things that we know to be absolutely pernicious and horrible and awful, and we definitely don't want to see those things. But what about people spreading conspiracy theories online? What about the things that we encounter every day that are harmful but not illegal? We think that there's much, much more that needs to be done politically in legislation that hasn't been done, that the government, with its enormous majority at Westminster, could actually do a lot more to achieve. And until those things are more fundamentally addressed, I think that trust deficit will remain.
With a few more questions over here, lady in the second row first of all, and then over here, and then I'll come to this side of the room.
I could address my question to Rachel and to Mark Frankel. To what extent, I mean, are you able to give, and every story clearly will vary, but how much time do you spend researching fact before you either abandon writing a story, or how much time you spend compared to the actual writing time? Because if you're skilled, the story will happen quite quickly, but the research time may be hellish. And could I ask you, please, how do you select what you're going to fact check? Do you select it, or do people send you things they ask you to check? And again, actually, what's the time quotient per thing you check? Because everything will cost. So you may have to sometimes make difficult decisions.
Okay, Rachel, you first and then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it does depend. I mean, this morning my story was about one of the MSPs here leaving the Scottish Conservatives, and I heard about it on Radio Scotland, and so like, right, well, I know that journalist who's speaking the story, and I know it's a trusted source, so I don't have to do quite so much research for that one, for example. But we do, quite often on a Sunday, for example, we do long read stories. They're about 1,000 words, for example, and so, yeah, a lot of research does go into that. And you do find then that, yes, there is actually more time spent doing research than there is on actually producing the actual writing of it. And I think newspaper outlets and broadcasters are understanding that a lot more and trying to put more time, giving journalists more time to do that sort of thing. So, for example, before I worked at the Scotsman, I was at DC Thomson, so doing the Courier and the Press and Journal. And I wasn't in this team, but there was an investigations team, and they were given months and months to do all their research. And I think there is now more awareness that needs to happen, because that is so important these days to try and get to the heart of all these stories. I think there is an understanding that journalists do need to be given more time to write these stories. Unfortunately, that does then sometimes mean that other journalists are then being put into sort of trends writing and digital writing to try and keep up with the demand of news online. So yes, there's definitely a bit more of an understanding that journalists need to be given more time for research. There are some journalists, particularly investigative journalists, who are being given that time. But I think that does then mean that there is then other journalists sort of having to then fill in the everyday demand, because people are wanting news all the time, constantly. So yeah, two competing thoughts there.
Okay, Mark, how do you divide your time then?
Yeah, it's a question we get often asked, and it's an important one. So I would say there's three broad areas that we have uppermost in our minds. Firstly, the harm principle, and the harm principle being how significantly harmful is this claim that's being made? Is it life-threatening? Are there people who could be hurt as a consequence of this? Are there consequences to this in people's reputation, in economic misfortune? Are there significant dimensions to this? Secondly, how repeated is this? Is it widely disseminated online? Has it been said by multiple public figures with large followings, so politicians, political leaders of one kind or another, and therefore it's getting a lot of traction and needs to be addressed? And thirdly, and I think this is often overlooked, how fact-checkable is it? There are a lot of things that we'll often encounter, and people will say, could you fact-check this, or is this something that you could look at? And when we look at it, it's not obvious that it's that fact-checkable, because it's either there are elements of information that might be missing. So we might have a certain amount of the jigsaw, but we would need a lot more in order to fact-check it, or the claim is so broad as our verdict is likely, therefore, to be, not particularly relevant or not particularly incisive. So I think those are the three areas. To your other question about, do people come to us? Yes, they do. We will sometimes fact-check what the public and our supporters and others bring to our attention, but we've got quite a full plate generally from things that are coming to us that we're seeing, in the press and in the political sphere and elsewhere online.
Okay, we've got a question here over near the window.
Thank you. I'm actually going to confuse things by saying, what about the facts that aren't in the sphere? And I really I'd like to address everyone to this, because actually some of the most important issues, like, for example, nutrition for the under fives worldwide, that tends to not be in the much of the media, or so it's the things that are left out that concern me, because actually you can fact check what you see, but the sins of omission are the ones that quite often, you know, are we going to eradicate polio? Well, not if we cut the budget from 0.5 to 0.3 in the Westminster government. So there's an awful lot of things that don't get through the information sort of gatekeepers, and those are the very things that we really, that means that the influence that those facts have become distorted, because the things that are getting through are the more disturbing ones, even when they're fact-checked.
There's a challenging question, facts by omission. The question was put to all of you, so I'll ask you all to be brief. So maybe start with you, Faith.
Well, thanks, that was a, that's a tricky one.
Give us more time to think.
Yeah, I'll be really honest, and I hadn't considered that before, and I think, you know, yeah, there are lots of things out there that don't make the headlines and that we don't discuss. So again, I think it just comes down to what we've all been talking about, like responsibility. And again, I'll talk from my perspective in that, you know, thinking about the things that young people do need to know. So, you know, as an educator, is it my responsibility probably to go and source that and find that out? So there we are, brief, like you asked.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Scott?
I would say on that this is the other side of the coin. You've exactly flipped the coin there. What you're talking about is an omission of attention. And as I was saying earlier, we are now in a world where attention is a currency. And what you're talking about is attention poverty. So you've got an issue there that's attention poor. And the best way, I hate to say this, and I am in no way happy to be saying this, it needs a better story. I know that sounds cruel, and you go, how can you get a better story than, or how can you get a more important story than nutrition for under fives? That is unfortunately not how stories work. We tell young people this all the time at SIF. Stories are what human beings live on. It's actually a nutrition to you. You cannot live without stories and what that particular cause needs. And I'm sure simply because of the lack of attention that they get, I am sure that there are people in here with other just as equally important stories and facts that are being omitted. And what's required is more attention and a better story for that fact and greater champions. And that is the noise that we all live in now. And it's how to write your stories and how to tell them to get more attention for the things that you are thinking are important.
Rachel, there's something in there about what makes the news and is therefore subject to scrutiny, and the things that don't quite make the news and might slip under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think newspapers in particular have very limited budgets. The staff numbers have been cut a lot. I mean, the team that we now have at the Scotsman is incredibly small now, just because of the sort of the media landscape and how things are at the moment. And that does mean that there's then more pressure on the story has to do well, because you can't rely on other stories doing well to then look at other stories that are just as important. And so it means that we're then kind of looking at, well, what story do we know is going to get eyes on the page? What story is going to definitely get people to pick up the paper? And so, for example, we know that stories about Scottish independence, they always tend to do quite well for us. And so we quite often write stories about Scottish independence, for example. But we know there's certain other stories, particularly if it's foreign affairs issues, for example, don't really hit with a Scotsman audience, for example. I know other newspapers do lots of things on those sorts of issues, but I know that for us, there's been times where it doesn't do so well. So there's been times where I've pitched a story thinking, oh, this is actually quite an interesting thing, I think we should do it. And the response is, it's not going to get eyes on the page. And I understand completely it's an important issue, but We also then need to think about how to fill the paper with things that people are going to buy, and how people buy subscriptions online and get eyes on the page, because that's unfortunately what we are sort of not graded on, but I suppose that's what the editors are looking for from us. Yeah.
Mark, you maybe partially answered this question earlier in relation to how you pick and choose what to spend your time on, but your thoughts on facts by omission and how we handle those?
It's a great question, actually, and I was thinking about this. I think we probably do this already, because politicians will routinely say, this is what we're doing, this is our version of fact, and we will say, actually, there's something by omission that you've left out through context or a lack of data. I'll give you one example of this. So the other day, the government, Keir Starmer's government, I should say, made a statement about NHS waiting times. And they said they were very proud that, having pledged that they would decrease the waiting times, that they had actually got there much earlier than they had anticipated. We did an FOI request on the data, and we discovered that actually, although they had increased the numbers of hospital appointments by the factor, beyond the factor that they had pledged in their manifesto, so had the previous government, and the previous government, and the previous government. So actually it wasn't much, the pledge wasn't really worth the paper it had been written on. And so there's an example of something that, they were looking at a factual piece of evidence in a particular way. We weren't totally clear that they had actually achieved what they had said they had achieved in the same way. We looked for some additional context. And so I think a lot of the work that my organisation is involved in isn't just looking at the prima facie evidence, but looking at the wider context where there are often alternative facts or missing information.
Okay, we've got some questions over here. The gentleman first of all, and then the lady behind.
Hi, thanks. Hello? Yeah, thanks very much. The conversation's been very much sort of contemporary, as if this is a new thing. And what I would like to do is ask Mark if his organisation was asked to fact-check the Scottish history curriculum that we teach our kids, and which forms a basis of them developing as an adult, how many marks out of 10 would it score? And the sort of thing I'm thinking about is, in Scotland, the South Asian community is extremely important. Has anyone heard of what happened in 1947 in the partition of India? So I don't think it's taught very much in schools. Equally, in Edinburgh, we're self-congratulatory about the Enlightenment which was carried out by a shower of white misogynist racists, as evidence is now suggesting.
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as a student of partition, I mean, I did many years ago, I did my dissertation on the partition of India. So, it's a subject that's very close to my heart. And I agree with you. There are certain things that are taught more rigorously today than perhaps they were previously. And there are certain things that we could concentrate on in the classroom that perhaps have become less of a focus in the curriculum than they might do. And we live in an age where we live in multicultural communities, and we need to, I think our education system needs to reflect that reality. I'm not sure this is a fact-checking question particularly, but I would say that a lot of the things that we, from a fact-checking point of view, that we encounter that we need to fact-check are often missing that historical context. So often politicians will talk about the reality of a society. For example, we've heard this from Reform recently around crime. There've been various allegations, statements that have been made about the propensity of certain communities to commit more crime. And this is not based on any analysis particularly, but a particular perspective that the party has of immigrant communities and their propensity to cause crime. It doesn't. We've searched and we've asked them and we've gone to them for evidence of this based on data, And it seems to be, you know, they pointed us to sort of particular incidents, but no particular pattern. So I think there is definitely a requirement that should be there for, from an educational point of view, for people to look at this much, much more broadly than they do.
The lady there. Yeah.
Thank you. We've lived through the age of Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage and Donald Trump, and I think one of their greatest achievements was to make such a large proportion of the electorate not care whether or not they were telling the truth. We were constantly reminded that Boris's lying was part of his charm. There are agencies that can tell you exactly how many times Donald Trump lied in his last term in office. So, particularly for Mark, this idea that fact-checking, important as it is what's going to make the difference. Is the difference not made when we start holding people accountable for their lies? If we can lock up protesters for saying the truth about Palestine and give them 14-year sentences, why did Boris Johnson get a £50 fine?
Just before I come to Mark on that question, can I just, and I will do, but can I just check with Faith? I mean, the suggestion there is that we've created people that just don't care about things because of this historical misinformation that's been going out. What about the next generation, the people that you deal with? Are you seeing that as they're coming up?
Yeah, I'm glad you actually asked me to follow up on this, because part of the work that I do now is anti-racist education, and there's a huge amount of work going on in Scotland with teachers around decolonising the curriculum within the standards for teaching, and also within like the learning for sustainability. It's about widening perspectives, challenging assumptions. So there is work being done around all aspects of the curriculum, including history, to bring in other narratives. Because we talk about in education, you know, the curriculum should be like a window and a mirror, and you know that is the idea that you're giving young people the opportunity to look out, but also the curriculum should be important for young people to see themselves reflected. So I hope that gives you a little bit of hope, maybe. But yeah, so thanks for bringing me in on that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's useful context. So, Mark, over to you. The question was put to you.
I feel like part of a question time audience here. Yeah, so I think what we have to remember is that Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Nigel Farage now, they were elected. Who put them there? We put them there. In a sense, I would circle all the way back to literacy on this. I'm not going to pass judgment on politicians. That's I'll leave that to others. I mean, you know, our work is, as I said before, to look at the evidence. You're right, though, that people lie. Politicians have lied. They will continue to lie. They will continue to deceive, and there will be half-truths that are circulated as a consequence, and people will be misled as a consequence. The way that I believe, and I think my organisation believes that we can address this best, is by ensuring that people are better equipped to see this at source, and when they are given a choice at the ballot paper on where to put their cross, they are making informed choices based on what they have seen in front of them, as opposed to being persuaded by the rhetoric, if you like, if I can put it in those terms. Boris Johnson definitely had a way with words. In a way, Donald Trump has a way with words for his American audience and for an international audience to some extent too. He's proved his popularity by being re-elected after being thrown out at the previous election. Why? I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, why did people turn back to him? They turned back to him for a variety of reasons, but one is that they felt that his message was sufficiently appealing, and they were prepared to overlook some of the inconsistencies and the things that he said that didn't add up or that were deceptive in one way or another. And it all comes back to a degree of literacy and a willingness to put yourself into a position where you can be better informed to make those judgments and hold people accountable in the way that you need to. But you're right, we're not, fact checkers themselves are not the answer. Here I am as a fact checker saying that. I think we're part of a solution. I'm not suggesting that we should all go away from this afternoon and immediately all become fact checkers. That's not going to solve the trust deficit. We need to start, as I said, much earlier in educational terms, and we need to be better equipped as a society.
So, Mark talked there a wee bit about the charm factor, if you like, of some of our political leaders. How do we counter that to make sure that there's another narrative?
That's what I was saying earlier about having a good story. Boris and all that, they have a good story. Trump has a good story. John York does brilliant work on this. Make America Great Again is a story. It gives you a starting point, it gives you an ending point, and it gives you something you can do in the middle, which is vote for Trump. And if Boris, what was the Boris 3-word slogan again? Take Britain back, stop the boats. It tells you a story, and it tells you something that you can do. You can become part of the story. So stop the boats tells you the boats are a problem, they need stopped, you're doing it. And that they can do it. So that's a story. It's got a typical structure. It's in 3 parts. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. What you've got is people who are prone to listening to stories. We all are, for the reasons I gave earlier. And everybody's asking Mark these questions. Mark's the doctor. So, like, fullfact.org, that's the tablets that you take when you've got the virus. But the virus couldn't care less, itis. And you've got, the entire society's got that virus, and what you want to get is a bit of herd immunity. So, and people are talking about memes and all that being a virus, and there's now antivirals like pre-bunking, which is like debunking stuff before it even gets started, and there are all of these things. And what we need is a bit of herd immunity, and the herd immunity needs to be, forgive the language, it needs to be, you know, when somebody says something that you go, nah, tell somebody else, nah. Take control of the story and tell another story. But it's stories. The whole thing is stories.
We've got a question in the aisle here, and then gentleman in the front row, and I'll come to the other two after that. Thank you.
Hi, my question is more about kind of taking it from the digital to the interpersonal, because I feel like, do you have any ideas of how we could encourage people to have those conversations more efficiently in person as well? Just from my personal experience, I've tried to debunk in person things that people have said that I was very certain weren't true, but it's so hard to not get angry in a way because you know people that are disadvantaged because of it, and it's hard to, then you have to go research all the facts, and it actually costs you so much time just to tell someone in an empathetic way, I think you're wrong, without being like, you're a complete idiot kind of thing. So I don't know, I just thought maybe it would be useful to, in newspapers, have like sections about like the current fake news and like how they got there, and how you kind of just make it easier for people to have an argument without pushing someone in front of the head and then they don't listen anymore.
Well, I think your work probably takes into both camps, the digital and the personal, so your reflections?
Yeah, I understand what you're meaning there, because there have been times before, stories recently, for example, where I've been talking to a group of friends, for example, and they're like, oh, that's not what it is. I'm like, no, it is. So I understand the point there. And again, I think it's, where do you find the facts, and can they be found quickly? And I know that there's lots of sort of the AI thing on Google now, and that does come up with an answer very, very quickly. And that's good because you want something speedy, but at the same time, it's where does that come from? And that's maybe not where the transparency then needs to come in. So you're then trying to think, right, where can I get something that's speedy and quick, that also is trusted? I know it is correct there as well. So I think that's something we need to work on there too. So, and I think that's when you're then looking at what sources do you trust. I know that people have opinions on newspapers and how trustworthy they are. Some people would trust other newspapers over not on others. I know that some people will say, oh, Scotsman's great, and other people say, oh, absolutely rubbish, the Scotsman, don't want to trust that paper. So that, I think, comes into it as well. It's like, where does it come from, and what can you say, yes, this is definitely the trusted source, that you can then find the information really quickly. And maybe that's where you come in there, maybe.
Yep. There is also a bit of it, sorry Mark, there is also a bit of a danger when you're trying to do that. They're doing a lot of science, there's a lot of science and data science going on at the moment. If somebody says vaccines cause autism, and you say vaccines don't cause autism, you've not actually, apparently, and this is not me doing the science, please somebody check it, Mark. You've actually not helped. You've just put vaccines and autism in the same sentence again. So it's not actually just as simple as going up to somebody and going, that's not true. You actually have to give them, you don't just deny something as the current thinking, don't just say that's not true. You actually have to have an alternative there and go, no, this. And actually have somewhere else to go to change that person's mind in a positive way and put another fact in there, or else that vaccines cause, I'm just spreading vaccines cause autism up here. Throw me off. Yeah, I'm the problem. Yeah. So sorry, I just wanted to put that in there. Apologies, Mark.
I'm going to put my Dr. Stethoscope on now, and I think the point you make, there's a really important point at the heart of this, which is about motivation. And we say when we're fact-checking something, the worst thing that we can do is to ascribe blame or to try to heighten the emotion of what is already quite a polarised situation. If somebody comes with a conspiracy theory, whether it's about vaccines causing autism or it's about anything else that is factually dubious or incorrect, I think the worst thing that you can do in conversation, forget the online, but to your point about in conversation, is to say you're wrong, or I know you're wrong because. What you need to do is to understand why they think like that. Where have they got that information from? Who have they been talking to? How reliable was that information? What did they do to probe at that information source? So, and as you're having that conversation about how they got to where they got to, that you will see that their eyes begin to sort of glaze a little bit, and hopefully they will go, actually, I'm challenging myself a little bit on this because, yeah, I'm not sure I should have trusted that source, or maybe that rabbit hole that I wandered down in order to end up there wasn't quite what I thought it was. And the best solution that you can end up with is a solution whereby you don't actually need to say that the person you're talking to is wrong. They've worked it out for themselves.
Okay, we've got a few questions in the front row, starting with the gentleman over, or lady next to him, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been to a few events here now and at the book festival and all these things, and I'm actually starting to become maybe a bit frustrated because I feel like the responsibility is put on the wrong people. I feel like we're hearing a lot about, oh, the individuals need to maybe calm down and get a grip, and we all need to think differently about things. But so much of this is driven by corporations that are spending billions of dollars every year on misleading us, and it's netting them a lot of money and power. And as long as that keeps happening, I'm not sure what we can do or what, education can do. I'm German, and, we always prided ourselves, I think, in a weird way, on being really honest about our history. And then in the last election, a quarter of the under 24-year-olds voted far-right extremist parties. How does that happen? It happened because of TikTok and Meta products for a large part. But it also happened for decades of failings of the politicians and media looking for scapegoats, and it all self-perpetuates. But as long as there is money to be made from misleading people, and money that you can't even fathom the amounts, so I'm just growing frustrated by. Sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional about that, but what is the point? What do you think is the point for the individual to seek the truth if we're in a machine that doesn't care or want us to know the truth, or where it doesn't make a difference?
Yeah. Can I follow up on that as well? So we had almost the same question. It's almost like we talked about over lunch. So these large organisations, the platforms we're talking about here, so your Metas, your Googles, whoever it might be, there almost seems to be an acceptance that there's going to be misinformation out there at the moment. I know they've made some changes recently around certain platforms. They have to prove your age to get onto, for example. But if you look at banks have invested an awful lot of money into making sure that disinformation disappeared to a certain extent through fraudulent transactions, what have you. So they've got data platforms, they've got AI platforms that will scrape all of the information and make sure that nothing gets through. I've had 3 fraudulent transactions over the last 2 weeks. So I know this to be true. So the answer to that is probably regulation. If these banks do not do what they should be doing, i.e. stop the fraud, stop the lies, stop the disinformation, they pay billions in fines. Why is that not happening to the social media companies and to the mainstream media companies?
Lots of frustration from both questioners there. Maybe I can come to you first of all, Faith. We talked earlier on about social media companies. Do you think there's a need for greater regulation here?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. I think that, you know, I think this problem is, like your frustration there, I don't think the problem's going to be solved by one thing. And I think, you know, more regulation will help stop the floodgates, for sure, and accountability, all the things that you're saying. I'm an optimist, and I work with young people, and I have to keep, for me to keep doing the job that I do, I have to keep having that faith, I think. And I wonder if, you know, we've found ourselves in this situation, this has just come upon us, but now we're having these conversations and having a bit of belief and hope in the future generations who, we're talking about it, we're transparent, we're being honest, we're having these discussions. Can we be hopeful for change, maybe? I think so.
I'll come to you in a second, Mark, but Rachel, I wonder, from your perspective, are we expecting too much of the individual against these giant corporations?
I suppose one of the issues that we sort of have as journalists is that we're so beholden to social media to help make our jobs work. If you think, it'd be lovely to think that every morning people go onto the Scotsman's website and have a look at their news there. We know that doesn't happen. We know that they're scrolling on social media, and so therefore we need to have our story on social media. So therefore we're constantly thinking, like, what's the algorithm? Have they changed the algorithm? How do we get these words and all these keywords and all the rest of it in our headlines, because it's going to hit on social media sites really well? Can it get shared on social media well, and things like that? And so I think one of the big problems that we then have is that we're so beholden to social media to actually get our industry to work at the moment. So that's one of the big problems, I think, there at the moment. And again, getting back to sort of trying to sort of find trust in institutions is probably going to help there too. And I don't know how we get to that at this point.
Mark, you've heard the frustrations that have been expressed. So what hope does the little person have in the face of these giant global corporations?
It's really tough. I mean, I hear your pain, and it's our pain too. We're directly in the firing line, having worked with some of these companies, and then earlier this year, Mark Zuckerberg decided that all fact checkers were politically biased, and he's walked away from the relationships that he had in the United States, and there's potential for him to do the same here in Europe. I think we have to be realistic, is the blunt truth. I mean, there's a test case at the moment. The BBC News website wrote it up. You can head there to have a look at it. A message board called 4chan, which some of you may have heard of, which is quite extremist in the content that it circulates, has fallen foul of our online safety regulations, and Ofcom are trying to fine it £20,000, which is fairly small fry, and they're appealing in the United States. The problem is that we're talking about a global problem, and we're a UK jurisdiction, and these are American companies by and large. Not all of them, but a large number of them, and the largest ones that you were mentioning, Google and Meta and so forth. So how can we affect a regulatory change? We all want to see the regulation in a way that will force them to act, unless the government in the United States, the Trump administration at the moment, is willing to back it, and they're currently not. So. Absolutely, but you know, that isn't the direction of travel at the moment. Yeah, but you know, I think the problem that we've got is that the powers that we've got under law here are fairly limited. The Online Safety Act, as I said earlier, is a fairly blunt instrument. It can fine the social media companies up to 10% of their operating revenue for transgressions of the Act. but the transgressions of the Act are limited to what's codified in the Act, which are largely these illegal harms that I was talking about earlier, and don't cover the whole plethora of things that we've been talking about this afternoon. So it's a very, very blunt instrument, and I think ultimately, in answer to your question, it comes to all of us petitioning, acting, and telling our government, whether it's here in Scotland or where I am from, down in London, in the UK, in England, that we're not going to cast our vote in their direction unless they're prepared to be bolder in their relationships with the social media companies, because it's the ministers that have those high-level relationships with the corporation leaders. So they're the ones who are having the relationships with the Zuckerbergs of this world and will be in the room with them.
Okay, I think we've got time for the last couple of questions. Do we have one here and one at the back?
Thanks very much for the discussion that we're having. There's so many areas that I'd like to go down, but I'm just going to stick to the media. We've heard about how the media rooms are shrinking, newsrooms are shrinking, and so journalists don't have as much time as they should have to research stuff. And now I'm a bit shocked to hear that these media rooms and traditional media, or legacy media, whatever you want to call them, are actually looking to social media to see what they're going to be writing about. And I just want to ask about, you've mentioned that us as individuals should be saying, is that true? Is that really true? Surely the journalists should be asking the politicians and the corporations that they're interviewing, is that really true? Can you prove that? Can you give us some evidence? Rather than saying, this is a great story, this is going to sell newspapers, or people are going to listen to the television or the radio.
Rachel, media has undoubtedly changed massively over the last decade or so.
Yeah, don't worry, day one of journalism school is definitely, is this true? So don't worry, that is day one of journalism school. But unfortunately, yeah, there is so much that's going to be focused on what is it people are going to want to read and what are they wanting to read, and that comes into the whole echo chamber thing of it as well. But yeah, I think that sort of helps. I mean, I'm based here, my office is just down over there actually in Parliament, and that helps because it means that if there is something I need to find out, then hopefully the politician or the press officer that I need to speak to is here too, and you can get to them nice and easily. So that's really good as well. Press offices, they sometimes have the facts and some of the answers, and I think over the years, the relationship between press offices and journalists has sometimes got a bit fractured, and it can be sometimes quite slow to get news, sometimes from press offices. So there's been times, thinking a few months ago, for example, the story was that Nicola Sturgeon was no longer being investigated by the police, for example. And there was a I can't remember exactly what the fact was, but it was a certain fact. Turns out it was true, but I was like, I can't print that because I haven't heard it directly from the police. And so I was trying to phone the police, and it's like, oh yeah, we'll get back to you. And that was like, I need to know now, sort of thing. And so that can come into it as well, trying to get to the speed of it as well. Journalists do want to get the truth. I mean, I know it sometimes doesn't happen. I know sometimes there are mistakes get made just because you're human. Yeah, very early on in journalism school, it is very clear that you've got to tell the truth all the time. You can't be making things up and all the rest of it. So journalists do want to do that. They do want to question, is this definitely true? And there have been times in the past where we have said, that's not true. For example, I was saying earlier about Nigel Farage when he came up to Scotland, and the journalists were saying to him, like, what you've said is not true, are you going to retract this? And so we do try, yes.
Okay, final question right at the back, please.
Hi, thanks. One of the concerns about misinformation and disinformation lately, it's related with foreign information manipulation and interference, which is a phenomenon that has been a problem, and being capable as well to permeate different electoral processes, referendums, elections, etc. So it is a real threat, and there's empirical evidence about that. My question is not what to do against that, but it's more how aware are we of those threats, and how also even small democracies are very vulnerable to those threats.
Okay, thank you. Scott, maybe ask you to respond to that. How vulnerable are we to these threats?
I think we're incredibly vulnerable. I think for a lot of what Rachel's been saying, what you're doing there is, if I've heard you right, is you're bundling in the omission, but there's also the problem of, like the fact check. You've got Rachel and Mark here, so if something untrue, if misinformation is put out, it's that thing that they've been saying, that a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth gets its trousers on. It's actually the labour intensity is falling on, and it's falling on fewer and fewer shoulders. So no, I think we are, and I genuinely don't think that I've seen anything coming from legislation in any country that is directly addressing this. And the reason for that is it's so fast moving. It's really fast moving. By the time you've caught up with one thing, and they've got the Online Safety Act, for example, you've now got another threat because somebody out there has invented a new way of disseminating the information just as quickly as possible. I think, yeah, it is a big threat. And I think every democracy, if you were there as a government, your first task as government, they tell you, is to protect the people. This is now one of the biggest threats to your democracy that exists. It's possibly bigger than the physical threat in many cases. So I think there has to be more education. I think the government has to be more. Now, I am no lawyer. What could be put in place? Maybe Mark would be a better place to tell us. But I think, yes, there is a massive threat. And, you know, we're coming up on election cycles in many countries. We've got one next year. The Americans have got the midterms. Elections around the world in small democracies. No, I think it's a massive threat.
We've expressed concern about the ability of young people to navigate all of this, but something that Scott said earlier on struck with me, that his teenage children are going to spot an AI quicker than he is. So in some regards, are young people actually ahead of us older people in this area?
Yeah, I think I said that before. I think that they are. I think they're incredibly clued up, and I think they're incredibly switched on to lots of things. And just kind of picking up what you were saying there, I think, you know, we talked about the individual, we've talked about government, and somebody brought up the question earlier about these men have been elected, and, you know, we don't seem to care that lies. But I think again, going back to what I teach, it's about we want to teach the skill of empathy in young people, and like thinking about, you know, if this happens, what's that going to look like? What's the impact of that going to be? So kind of going broader and thinking, well, these lies are out there, this disinformation's out there. What is the impact of that? And what is the impact if you're going to vote in May? It's so important to have the correct information, because if you don't, there will be impact. And that's what I feel.
Okay, in winding up, I'm going to ask each of our panel members just to give us about a minute or so of their thoughts to sum up the discussion that we've had today. And I'm just going to start with Scott and come down the line.
To sum up, we live in a digital world. It's a digital ocean. And if your children or your citizens work in the ocean, possibly you might get them a life belt or at least teach them to swim. So that's basically, at SIF, our charity exists to break down the barriers to allow young people who might not be able to access the media and so on. They might not, there's a power imbalance, there's an access imbalance. So we're working to try and break that down. Because if you don't, what you find around the world is that it takes energy. If you're poor, you tend not to make the right decisions. As you know, they've proved this. If somebody's wealthy, they don't have to worry about that. So poverty is actually a hindrance to making those correct decisions, and that's what you're asking people to do every day. So I would say, yeah, the media education is vital. Yeah, we're in a digital world. Everybody needs to learn to swim.
Mark?
Yeah, so I think that this is a critical time for us all. We've talked a lot about trust. We've talked a lot about the mistrust that we have come to accept and the cynicism that we've come to see as standard and as normal. And I think the solutions, the answers to this crisis lie within us. We've spent a lot of time blaming what's out there But in the end, we need to better equip ourselves in how to spot it, decipher it, and overcome it. And those are things that we all have within us. It's not rocket science. These are things that are available to us. There are tools that are available to us. There are courses that are available to us. There are things that we can do that can better equip ourselves to be more informed, to gain greater currency on what we see around us. That's part of the solution. I think the other part of the solution is to see this as a campaign, because it is a campaign. I think we can't win the fight against misinformation, and it is a battle. I would say it's a battle as large as the battle we have with climate change, the battle that we have in other ways with ensuring that we live in a safe and secure world. But we can't win this battle, we can't win this fight unless we're prepared to stand up for what we believe in. And that means taking the fight to our governments, to those who are in positions of power and authority, to make representations on our part to the social media companies, to those corporations who hold those positions of power and authority in terms of what we see, and algorithmically how much of it we see. Because we need to take the battle to them directly in order to be in a position to win it.
Faith?
Yeah, can I just say what they said? Because I think that what Mark actually is touching on there, it's about being a good citizen. And I think the fact that we're all here today having this discussion, having these open conversations is what we need to be doing, and it's what we need to encourage other younger generations to do. And your question earlier about how do we talk about it, and I think it's like we get curious, we teach ourselves to be able to have conversations where we challenge, and we challenge politely, and we teach the skills to do that, so conversation becomes the norm. And yeah, we become citizens where, like you said, we're arming ourselves to deal with things like this.
Thank you. And Rachel?
I think one thing that we've definitely learned from here is that there is definitely a will to try and tackle this. There's definitely a desire to tackle it. So that's something that can only be positive moving forward. One thing that we sort of need to get on top of is I feel like so much of it is reactionary, because so many things travel so fast, online especially. And so whether it's the media, whether it's politics, government, or just society at large, it is just so reactionary at this point, and that's one of the problems we're going to have to come up with. I think the other problem as well is just the priorities. If you think about government trying to tackle these issues, we've got so much limited time and a limited budget, and there's other issues such as the NHS, the economy, the cost of living crisis, that are almost always going to have to come first. And so that, again, is going to feed into all of these things. It's almost like we need to sort these issues that are sort of immediate to people first before we can then tackle issues that are just as important, but perhaps maybe aren't getting the time and the money spent on them in the government. So I think priorities need to be looked at as well there, and how we tackle some of these issues that are happening.
Okay, thank you everyone. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. I hope you've got a lot out of it. I'd be really fascinated to hear your feedback. You can use the QR codes around the organisation, or there are some paper copies at the back, and the festival assistants will help you with those. Just a final reminder that there are 2 last events in today's final day of the Festival of Politics that you may be interested in. But for now, can I just ask you to join me in thanking our panel, Rachel, Faith, Mark and Scott. Thank you.